For those of you who are still following along, I get to do a devotion on the book of Revelation, and I chose Revelation. They didn't choose it for me. You may or may not know I've been doing teaching Revelation via an online class for the last several weeks. We're actually going to be starting chapter 9 this week. But today I wanted to focus on chapter 7 of Revelation. One thing about Revelation is that it's a book, in my opinion, on comfort and hope. And that may seem strange based on how you've probably read the Tim LaHaye books and other related propaganda related to Revelation. And it's actually made the book scary for a lot of people. And there are scary parts. Don't get me wrong, locusts with lion heads and horses who look very similar and scary, and these angels that are hard to describe in humanly terms. Yeah, that is scary. But at the same time, we know through the book of Revelation that we have a sovereign God and a God who is here with us. So what you see in Revelation is actually, Revelation 7, is a interlude between the seals, the first 6 seals. We have an interlude before the 7th seal, and then of course going into trumpets where things even get worse for those who are unbelievers when you go into chapters 8 and 9. One thing you want to know about Revelation, or remember, I guess, probably a better way to say, is that it is an apocalyptic book. It is a book that has been interpreted in many ways. It has been analyzed to death to a point of where it has become scares people more than it helps people. And that was not John's intent, the author's intent. Apocalyptic literature was a genre of literature that was around for about, you say 400 years. It was started early or about 2nd century BC and ran into the 2nd century AD. And it was something that not only we see here in Revelation, the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, you'll see that in, of course, a lot of secular works, and then rabbinic work as well that was considered to be apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, sometimes people think this is just talking about another big word, eschatological events or events of the future, but actually apocalyptic works were typically about the time that they were going through at this point. And so the people that John was writing to were Christians in the Roman provinces, and at this time Rome was not favorable of Christians, and especially with the Emperor Domitian, who was killing Christians and torturing them and doing all kinds of bad things to them. And so what the people needed was a book of hope and encouragement and comfort, and that's what John was providing here. So we see that, and as we go through Revelation, and especially as you look through a lot of the symbolism and everything within Revelation, we have to look at it more as an artwork to be experienced, much like the Sistine Chapel. You can walk into the Sistine Chapel, look around to see what the artist was intending to do, and experience it and not analyze it. And that's how Revelation should work as well. And as we look through that, we'll be able to see that there is a God that is sovereign. There is God that is faithful, and then there's also a beauty to God that is hard for us to really understand and figure out. So I'm not going to go verse by verse through chapter 7, but there are a few highlights I wanted to point out. If you wanted to go verse by verse, you can of course join us with our online class that we're doing in Revelation right now. But so the idea that I wanted to bring up is that hope is all they had at the time, based on the amount of oppression and persecution. Some people refer to that as tribulation that they were going through. And I mean the Christians of that time, as well as the Jews of that time as well. And that's what they needed to hear. They need to hear that now, and we need to hear that now, that we have a God who sustains us and is faithful. Revelation was not written to frighten people and increase their anxieties. That was not John's intent at all. It was not written to prepare them for a future tribulation. As humankind has always existed, it's some level of oppression, affliction, and distress. Tribulation has been a word that has been overused and abused by those in power who want to keep people afraid and keep them, I guess, succumb to the worries and fears that people sometimes do. So like I said, it was John's intent to write this through the most tragic of human circumstances, which, as you can imagine, looking through what was going on there, was very tragic for the people. But at the same time, to see a God that offers life and hope. So the 2 points that I wanted to bring up with this is, first of all, God does not abandon. And we see that if you look at the 144,000, I'll get a little bit more detail of that here in a second. But we're looking at this question, actually this idea of God does not abandoning. is a question that we deal with at our own home right now. We, of course, work with our children and to speak with them about how God does not abandon us, even though sometimes it feels like he does. There is no promise made in Revelation or anywhere else for the most part that the faithful will not suffer hardship, persecution, or martyrdom. It happens, and it continues to happen. It continues to happen to this day. It is expected. It was expected then. It's expected now, and the people listening along would understand and know that. What is promised is that no matter how bad it gets, God is there. God is with us, no matter how dark the situation becomes. Just to jump onto the idea of the 144,000, some people there's thousands of theories. There's several books written on it. But the idea is that the usage of this and this sort of writing, anytime you see something like at this level of number, anything so 1,000 or thousands upon thousands or tens of thousands upon tens of thousands or myriads to myriads of thousands, what it means is it's uncountable. You can think of what Abraham was promised by God, that his people, his descendants, would be like the sands on the beach of the ocean. You can look at it as the stars in the sky. So it's uncountable. These 144,000 that were not to be abandoned by God. These martyrs who are not to be abandoned by God. The second point I wanted to make here is to keep our faith in God. Even though God may not do our bidding, and we have this idea nowadays in our postmodern world that God, through the idea of moralistic therapeutic deism, this idea that God is the good old guy in the sky who's going to do our bidding, or the good, friendly grandfather who will do whatever we want. He does not. It is not his desire to do that, because we don't know what our own needs are most of the time, and we don't always get what we want, especially in difficult times. We must still, however, keep our faith in God and what God has promised us. The people in Rome did that at that time. The people who lived there in Rome must keep the faith. The people of us today, here, throughout all of history, must keep the faith. The multitude that you see in chapter 7 of Revelation, they kept the faith. That is why they're there with God there at the heavenly throne. And so, even if it gets hard, it is hard. It's hard all the time. There is a lot of distress. There's a lot of oppression. There's tribulation in our lives. We are to keep the faith. And so I just want to encourage you to keep the faith. Much like when you read in the book of Daniel, you have our three friends who were thrown into the lion's den. They kept the faith. They would not worship Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. They kept the faith. John sees the same thing as he writes Revelation. The people were to keep the faith, even though many would be martyred, and he witnessed a lot of that. We know through this faith, through our faithfulness, that God is faithful, and that he is, no matter what our circumstances are, is faithful in us. True faith in God persists through no matter what the circumstances is. Any time of crisis, God's faithfulness persists. And so I encourage you to keep that in mind as you go forward this week.